Welcome, everyone. This is Dr. Mercola helping you take control of your health. And today we are joined by Francis Boyle, who is really has quite the pedigree. He had his undergraduate training at the University of Chicago and got his JD lawyer degree from Harvard and also a PhD in political science. And he's been quite active in the protection environment from the U.S. government and their creative strategies for bioweapons. And specifically, we're talking about coronavirus today. So welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me on, Dr. McCullough, and my best to your viewing audience.
All right. So the coronavirus is a virus that seems to have come from Wuhan. And if you're like me, most of the people in the U.S. have probably never heard of Wuhan before, but it's a pretty big city. It's bigger than New York City. There's 11 million people in this city. So obviously China is a large country which over a billion people, but it's still a large metropolis. It's not some rural urban farming community. So it's affected over 50,000 people in China as we're recording this in February 14th. So I'm sure it's going to be more by the time this podcast airs. And I'm wondering if you could provide us with your speculations as to how this apparently engineered virus was produced and how it came to be out of Wuhan. Because it wasn't due to bat soup. We know that's for sure.
Oh, that's Chinese propaganda for sure. Well, let me back up a little. I was the one who called for U.S. domestic implementing legislation for the Biological Weapons Convention of 1972 and drafted it, known as the Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act of 1989, that was passed unanimously by both houses of the United States Congress and signed into law by President George Bush Sr. So as a result of this anti-biological warfare work going back to the early days of the Reagan administration that was using DNA genetic engineering to manufacture biological weapons, I have been observing mysterious outbreaks of disease for both humans and animals around the world since then. Indeed, my Biowarfare Anti-Terrorism Act was specifically designed also not only to deal with regular biological weapons, but also with DNA genetic engineering for biological weapons that was just coming into its infancy when the BWC was being drafted. And even though the BWC would cover DNA genetic engineering, I wanted to make it clear that by name that it was covered. And I also made it clear it covered synthetic biology as well. That was in there too. So when these unexplained mysterious illnesses break out, I monitor for them a while. Usually I just conclude they can be explained by normal reasons, lack of sanitation, poverty, things of that nature. But in Wuhan, it seemed pretty suspicious to me. And there is this biosafety level 4 facility there in Wuhan. It's the first in China. It was specifically set up to deal with the coronavirus and SARS. SARS is basically a weaponized version of the coronavirus. There have been leaks before of SARS out of this facility. And indeed, the only reason for these BSL-4 facilities, based on my experience, is the research, development, testing, and stockpiling of offensive biological weapons. So for that reason, I stated my opinion that this Wuhan coronavirus leaked out of that BSL-4 facility. The first reported case was December 1. So if it depends what the incubation period is. The official party line is 14 days. A British health expert has said he believes it's 24 days. North Korea is taking the position it's 30 days, and they have their own biological warfare experts there. So it seems to me there was a leak at this facility, maybe mid-November. It was reported up the line, and the Chinese government has been lying about it and covering up ever since. And as for Wuhan and the Hubei province, sure, they're basically under martial law. There's no other word for it. If you read even the statements by President Xi and his assistants, they've made it very clear they're at war here, and that is correct. They're at war with their own biological warfare agent. President Xi just fired the party apparatchiks in charge of this, and have brought in trusted military personnel to handle it, as well as large numbers of PLA forces saying, well, they're healthcare workers. They don't look like healthcare workers to me. So as of now, that's my best reading of the situation, Doctor.
So it appears, at least there's some stories that are out there that suggest that the coronavirus originally was stolen from a lab in Canada, in Winnipeg, and then brought into China at this BSL-4 facility in Wuhan. Do you have any thoughts on that?
It could have been. I mean, I want to make it clear that, in my opinion, they were already working on that at that Wuhan BSL-4 facility. They were working on a biological warfare weapon involving SARS, which, as I said, is a coronavirus to begin with. We do know that this Dr. Mengele Karakawa up at the University of Wisconsin, he's now in Japan, I guess, which is due north of me. He resurrected the Spanish flu virus for the Pentagon, obviously for weapons purposes, and he specializes in mating the Spanish flu virus to all sorts of hideous biowarfare instrumentalities. And there was also a record then of him shipping his products up to Winnipeg. Winnipeg is Canada's equivalent of our own Fort Detrick. It's a BSL-4 facility, and yes, they research, develop, test, manufacture, stockpile every type of hideous biological warfare weapon that we know of. So some of this technology could have been stolen from Winnipeg. I don't know about that, but as I said, the Wuhan BSL-4 was already working on this to begin with. They had already developed SARS. SARS had leaked already before, two to three times before this, and it seems that they were turbocharging SARS, which that's what this looks to be the case. This is a brand new generation of biowarfare weapons we haven't seen before. Its lethality goes from 15%, as estimated by Lancet, up to 17 to 18% by a British health official, and even Chinese statistics. Its infectivity is 83%. It can affect maybe 3 to 4 people for every person infected. It has gain of function properties, which means it travels through air at least 6 or 7 feet. And it does appear now there are reports that even contaminated human feces give it off, that the human feces radiate off maybe 6 or 7 feet. So we've never seen anything like this before in the history of biological warfare, at least in the public record. I want to make it clear, Doctor, I have never worked for the United States government. I've never had a security clearance. I've never had access to any type of secret information. I just read what is in the public record and the scientific record, and try to draw my own conclusions. And that's what I'm giving you today. I could change my opinion if people can provide me reputable scientific evidence to the contrary. I've made this plea before. People will send me things that don't look very convincing. So right now I'm standing by my conclusion that it leaked out of the Wuhan BSL-4. The highest level of the Chinese government has known about it. They've been covering it up from the get-go until they informed the WHO at the end of December. Well, this is a specially designated WHO research lab. So why is the WHO specially designating a BSL-4 Nazi biological weapons lab? Because the WHO is up to its eyeballs in this type of work and has been for quite some time. So you can't believe anything coming out of the WHO. You really can't believe anything coming out of the Chinese government except negative information, Doctor.
Yes, and so there's a collusion between the WHO, the CDC in the United States, and Big Pharma, who seems to be providing much of the financial support for these organizations.
That is correct. And I won't go through the long history of Big Pharma getting involved in this. There's huge amounts of money here. I believe that West Africa Ebola pandemic originated out of the US BSL-4 facility in Sierra Leone. And they were testing out a so-called vaccine that contained live Ebola and gave it to these poor people. And as for the CDC, you are correct, Doctor. CDC has been involved in every type of Nazi-type BSL-4 biological warfare death science you could possibly imagine. I don't have time to go through it all here. But it's a matter of public record that during the Reagan administration, the CDC and the American Type Culture Collection sent 40 shipments of weapons-grade biological warfare agents to Saddam Hussein in Iraq in the hope and expectation that he would weaponize these agents and use them against Iran in the war they had between them. He had already used chemical weapons that NATO allies had given to him. And of course, the problem there is when that war was over, that war by President Bush Sr., an order was given to U.S. military forces to blow up Saddam Hussein's biological warfare facilities. And that's not how you deal with biological warfare weapons. So all that did was blow back in their faces, and contaminated our own U.S. troops. And that had a role to play, a causative factor in the Gulf War syndrome today. The last figures I looked at have murdered about 11,000 U.S. troops and disabled about 100,000 of them at least.
So no one is claiming that the United States had anything to do with this coronavirus in Wuhan.
But let me say, those allegations have been made. I have looked at the allegations so far, but I'm not convinced that the United States government did this. I think it was a leak out of the BSL-4. Certainly, if anyone has credible information that the U.S. government was behind this, I'll be happy to take a look at it.
Sure.
But right now, I don't see it. Although I will say this, President Xi knows exactly what happened there. And I guess if he concludes the U.S. government was behind this, there will be retaliation. But right now, I just don't see it that way, Doctor.
Yeah, I guess that may be more appropriately phrased. There doesn't appear to be any apparent credible evidence that the U.S. is involved. However,
I would put it, and I want to clarify that. Yes.
Sure. Yeah. However, you have very carefully documented that since 2011, at least your initial calculations, and maybe updated to current 2020, the U.S. has spent $200 million in this biological warfare program.
Let me
Which,
correct that, Doctor. And
sure,
I don't mean any disrespect to you at all,
sure.
but I mean you're a medical professional, and I recognize your professional qualifications. I crunched the numbers on this, going from the 9/11/2001 terrorist attacks until October of 2015.
Mm-hmm.
The United States government had spent $100 billion
Yeah, I had it off
on,
by a thousand.
right, and you can, I gave a very extensive interview on this if you
Sure.
want to Google Sherwood Ross. I answered his questions. Actually, I wrote the answers. $100 billion on this Nazi biowarfare, death science, dirty work. There's no other word for it. Now, to put that into perspective, Doctor, in constant dollars, we spent $40 billion on the Manhattan Project from the time Einstein sent his letter to President Roosevelt until the terrible bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki that killed 200,000 completely innocent human beings. So obviously, this is a weapons program. We have an offensive biological warfare industry. As of 2015, again, the last time I crunched the numbers, we had over 13,000 supposed life scientists involved in this death science Nazi biowarfare industry. Now, since 2015, I haven't had time to crunch the numbers, but it's about $5 billion per year. So as of now, without going back and recrunching these numbers, I would say the figures since 9/11/2001 are about $120 billion.
Mm-hmm.
And then I haven't really had a chance to go back and crunch the numbers from the Reagan administration on up to 9/11/2001. But I guess you'd add some more billion on there. Clearly, the Reagan administration, under the influence of its neoconservatives, who definitely believe in biological weapons and ethnic-specific biological weapons, you can see that in the PNAC report, were engaged in the use of DNA genetic engineering for the purpose of manufacturing biological weapons. And that is why I gave a congressional briefing in Washington, D.C. in 1985. I was asked to do that by the Council for Responsible Genetics that I work with, that involved the leading life scientists in the world from MIT and Harvard. I spent 7 years there at Harvard. I have 3 degrees, and I knew all these people. And they asked me to serve as their lawyer and asked me to give this congressional briefing. I blew the whistle, and then they asked me to draft the implementing legislation, which I did. So that's how far back publicly available figures are.
Yeah, so you are have been associated with the Council for Responsible Genetics for quite a while. I believe they first spun up in the mid '80s or so.
It was 1983, and
yeah.
Dr. Jonathan King, who is a professor of microbiology at MIT, and the founder and operator, I believe, their microbiology lab, set it up. And he asked his friends, their life science friends at Harvard, to join him. And I knew all those people. So they asked me to serve as a lawyer for them. You can find this on the Council for Responsible Genetics webpage. Although I want to make it clear, and they asked me to do specifically biological warfare work with them. They have other agenda. They're against genetically modified food. But I haven't been involved in that. I've simply been dealing with biological warfare. I also deal with chemical warfare. But I want to make it clear, I'm not here to speak in their name. I'm only speaking in my name. But if you have a look at my book, Biological Warfare and Terrorism, Professor King wrote the foreword. So, I have the leading MIT professor of molecular biology there supporting what I'm saying. If you don't think I know enough science about it, so.
Oh, I have incredible respect for that Council for Responsible Genetics. They were the very first professional organization to voice concern over GMOs and, of course, the genetic engineering consequences of biowarfare, for which you're an expert on. So you're not a newcomer to this game. You've been involved with this for many decades now. So thank you for all your diligent, perseverant work.
Thank you for having this interview. I think it's very important for your listening audience to have, or your viewing audience have some idea what's going on here.
Oh, absolutely.
Our government is lying to us as to precisely
Absolutely.
what's going on and what the dangers are. I'm not here to panic anyone. I'm here to give the truth as I see it. And so your viewers can evaluate it.
Well, I'm personally not too concerned that there's a threat directly to the United States people. I mean, we have had 15 reported cases. No one's died so far. And I'm not sure that it's going to be a
one
pandemic.
death in Chicago, Doctor.
Oh, one death. Okay, I'm sorry.
Right.
So
Someone came back from Wuhan, and I believe the spouse was involved, got it, and died.
okay, so it's small numbers, and I don't think it's going to impact us. But I think the implications.
Well, Doctor, again, even the CDC. I'm sorry to correct you on that.
No, that's fine. I'm happy to be corrected. I'm here to learn.
Even today, the CDC has said that they are not optimistic about this being contained in the United States. According to a report, U.S. Northern Command has triggered their pandemic preparations. We do know that the United States military has designated several detention sites around the country. So maybe these are all precautions. I don't know. But
all I can go on is
take it seriously.
Historical evidence, because when President George Bush Jr. Was in office, he was concerned about the bird flu pandemic, and I wrote a book on it called The Bird Flu Hoax, which is a New York Times bestseller. And he projected that 2 million Americans would die. You know how many Americans died in that
right.
pandemic? Zero.
And you're correct. That was another DNA genetically engineered biological warfare weapon. It was a chimera. It had 3 different elements in it. And we were all lucky that somehow they attenuated the lethality and the infectiveness of the bird flu. That is correct. And it wasn't as dangerous as certainly I feared and others feared. And maybe this will prove to be the case here. But if you look at what's going on there in China, it doesn't look very good, Doctor.
No. Well, that's where the epidemic started. And, there's no flights going in and out of China. So they're holding that spread. And I just don't believe it's going to personally impact the United States very much. Economically, it will be because of the enormous impacts on the supply chain of the raw materials that China feeds the world with. So, this is going to be a serious economic impact on the world, not just China. So, no question about that.
Doctor, I certainly hope you're right.
Yeah.
That this will be able to be contained.
But let's explore the more obvious and concerning implications. They put in $120 billion at least, more so than the Manhattan Projects. And to the best of our knowledge, they really haven't implemented this yet, except, at least as far as I can discern, shortly after 2001, where they had the anthrax scare, and they used that as the impetus for signing the Patriot Act, which is the first start in taking away our political freedoms and making this a tyrannical state.
That is correct, Doctor.
Yeah. So to me, that's more concerning than the infection.
Well, let me also amplify on that. What's called Amerithrax came out of a U.S. government biological warfare weapons lab and program. And I publicly blew the whistle on that in the first weekend of November 2001 the Council for Responsible Genetics was having its convention at Harvard Business School, and I was chairing a panel with Dr. King and our other experts on biological warfare, on U.S. biological warfare programs. And as I was walking into the Harvard Divinity School, Fox TV had a camera crew there, and I said, obviously, this came out of a U.S. biological weapons program, and probably Fort Detrick.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went and conducted this session and made the same comment. Then I came back here. I made a comment to a Washington, D.C. Radio station to that effect. Then I made a comment to that effect to the BBC. So everyone in the world heard me. And then at that point, someone gave an order that I was never to be interviewed again by any mainstream news media on biological warfare programs. And that's been the case since the first week of November. That is correct. And they used that Amerithrax to ram the Patriot Act through. That is correct. You are perfectly correct. And as I pointed out in my book, Biowarfare and Terrorism, I think the same people who were behind the 9/11 terrorist attack were also behind the Amerithrax. But you know that I'm just connecting dots there. But I think you're certainly correct, as I pointed out in my book.
The reality is we lost a lot of freedom as a result of this. That's indisputable fact. No question.
Police state, Doctor.
Yeah, that's exactly. And that's the primary concern. And then they're adding censorship on that. They've censored you. They've censored.
After that, I immediately went out and reread Orwell's 1984, Doctor. And that is the type of state we are living in today. You are perfectly correct. And I gave a lecture up in Chicago at the Boyle Law School to lawyers, not law students in the Chicago area, on the totalitarian nature of the USA Patriot Act. And then we have the, FISAs and everything else, and Snowden has correctly pointed out, the federal government is spying on everything we say, all of our electronic communications, you name it. And again, the proof is I've been completely blackballed out of all U.S. media. Indeed, if you go back and look at the Amerithrax attacks, they also hit mainstream U.S. media to make it clear to them that if they covered this issue, they will be killed too. So the mainstream U.S. media is simply not contradicting the party line coming out of the CDC, NIAID, National Institutes of Health. I mean, they're all in cahoots together with this Nazi biological warfare work. So you're perfectly correct, Doctor.
Yeah, well, I don't know that it need any additional threats because most of the news media are owned by just a few corporations. That's it. So they just have to control it from the top down, and everyone falls in line. And it's not just the federal government. It's the largest, the companies that are largest monopolies in the history of the world, like Google, that has essentially a surveillance tool on steroids through all their different devices, their Android phones, their Google Chrome, their browser, their email system, their search engine. I mean, they're just surveilling the entire population. And the sooner people begin to understand that and take evasive actions and against that, then the more we'll be able to preserve our privacy. But I'm wondering, in light of this incredible investment and the incredible knowledge and biowarfare agents they've already developed, and you're one of the leading experts in the world on this, what is your projection as to what might happen, or what do they plan on doing with this? Because other than the Patriot Act implementation, I don't see any major implementation of this investment at this point.
Not yet that we know of, but it's all there ready to go, except they've used the Amerithrax. That was super weapons grade anthrax, 1 trillion spores per gram.
Right.
It had nanotechnology involved. silicon coating, and they've used it once already to get that Patriot Act. And there is still and as you know, anthrax does not degrade. So there's still a stockpile of super weapons grade anthrax out there, either at Fort Detrick or
But that's probably
or somewhere else.
the tip of the iceberg of the weapons that they've developed.
Right. They're going to use them. That there's no question
So
about it. Because
what is your projection of how these agents might be used? What can you outline some scenarios, possible scenarios that might come to play?
Well, it's not just me, Doctor.
Well, okay, whoever with your knowledge.
There was a tabletop exercise at Johns Hopkins University last fall. You can read about this on the internet on coronavirus. Tabletop exercise, that's a euphemism for a war game, okay? And their estimate was that it killed 65 million people. You can read that in the Daily Mail. Now, let me say this, Johns Hopkins is up to their eyeballs in this Nazi biological warfare dirty work. They have a BSL-3 facility there. I haven't seen BSL-4, but they have a BSL-3 that they proudly announce on their webpage, and that they do dual use offensive, defensive, biological warfare work.
Just to emphasize, that's the only purpose of these labs is for offensive biowarfare agents. That's it. There's no other reason they exist.
No, Doctor, let me back up a bit. They justify it by saying, well, they're developing vaccines. Okay. No, it's very important. How do they do that? They go out around the world, and this is a matter of public record, and scour for every type of hideous disease, fungus, virus, bacteria you can possibly imagine. They then bring it back to these BSL-4 labs, and they develop an offensive biological agent using DNA genetic engineering and now synthetic biology, which synthetic biology was set up by the Pentagon under DARPA. They paid for the whole darn thing. Okay. Now, once they then have this offensive agent, they then proceed to develop what they call a vaccine, because the agent is no good unless you can have a vaccine to protect your own people. So sure, they're developing vaccines to have a biological weapon, because a biological weapon consists of two elements: the offensive biological warfare agent in the first place, and then second, a vaccine to protect your own people. And that is what is being done at all these BSL-4 facilities, and many of the BSL-3s as well.
Yeah. So
and Johns Hopkins has a BSL-3, and they admit they do dual use. That's what dual use means, Doctor. They first developed the offensive biological warfare agent, and then they developed the vaccine, or the supposed vaccine.
That's right. I think that's a good term, supposed, because to say I'm beyond skeptical of if its effectiveness is a very serious understatement. I just don't think they're going to work, these vaccines.
Well, we'll see. I really don't know. You'd have to see.
No one knows.
That's what they were testing out in Sierra Leone that set off the West African Ebola pandemic coming out of the US BSL-4 there, run by Fort Detrick and Harvard, MIT, Broad Institute, and others. They were testing out an alleged vaccine on the people there, which is typical Western pharmaceutical companies. We test out these vaccines first on poor Black people in Africa. And these vaccines, whatever vaccine they were testing out, I think it was Glaxo or something, had live Ebola in there. So that's what gave them the Ebola. So you're right. There's no guarantee that any of these vaccines are going to work.
The likelihood is pretty low. But here's why I'm so not as concerned about this pandemic, because I understand biology, And I know that 1 in 5 people in this world die from sepsis. That's an astonishing fact, but it's true. 1 in 5 people die from sepsis. And we have a very simple, inexpensive, safe, virtually no side effects treatment for it. It's called intravenous ascorbic acid or vitamin C with small doses of thiamine or vitamin B1 and hydrocortisone that rescues 85% of the people. They're not using this in China, yet there's studies going on now. They haven't been started, but they're in the process of implementing them to try this therapy for coronavirus. So there's no doubt in my mind it's going to be effective because it's utilizing natural processes that our body was designed from time immemorial to combat these viral infections. These viral infections are not new. They may be novel. We may not have experienced them before, but we have these intrinsic protective mechanisms that can adapt to using our own immune capacity to defeat them and not relying on some engineered vaccine.
Well, we'll have to see about that, Doctor. You could be right. The one reported instance we have of treatment working to deal with this Wuhan coronavirus is using anti-AIDS drugs. There were doctors in Thailand who put out a study, and that might be working because, as far as I can tell, this Wuhan coronavirus is a chimera. It has, first of all, SARS, which is a weaponized coronavirus to begin with. It has HIV genetic material in there. That was in a published article by the Indian scientists, which I read. You could see the pictures right there. Political pressure was brought to bear upon them, so they withdrew it. And probably the flu virus in there as well, along with these gain of function properties. So if there is, it seems to me there's HIV in there, then I would concur with these Thai doctors that anti-AIDS drugs very well might help here, and then treating people that have pneumonia with anti-AIDS drugs. But again, I'm not a medical doctor. That's just what I've read so far.
Yeah, if there's impairment in the immune system, there may be some benefit to them because obviously that's the way AIDS takes you out. That's what it's called for, acquired immune deficiency syndrome. So, and that's why people die because their immune system's impaired. But that's not how people are dying from coronavirus. They're dying from shock, septic shock. They're going into failure.
Well, I think we've covered all our points, right?
I think so too. Yeah. So
right,
I deeply appreciate all the work you've done, not only now recently in this coronavirus, but throughout your entire career. Your commitment, your dedication to the truth and to protection of humanity is most noble. So thank you for all your service to mankind.
Well, thank you very much, Doctor. And I do hope that your prescription there for how to treat this works out. And I certainly hope it's not going to be as dangerous as certainly I feared here in the United States, at least. I guess we'll have to see what happens. But what concerns me, Doctor, is that President Trump has junk scientists giving him advice there. And what really concerned me was that he called up President Xi, or President Xi called him up, and President Trump commended Xi on what a great job he was doing over there. So obviously he's not getting proper advice. His national security advisor, O'Brien, well, he's Bolton Light. He's one of these neocons. Pompeo was behind me at Harvard Law School, a diehard militarist and Fellow Society guy. Fauci he's up to his eyeballs in biological warfare work. CDC is up to it. So I am concerned that right now, I just don't think President Trump is getting proper advice on how to deal with this and protect the American people.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. He may be confused on a variety of issues, and this might be one of them. Right. So, all right. Well, thank you again. I really appreciate all your fine effort.
Thank you for taking the time to do the interview.